Etta Vance had $200 left to her name, a baby coming in 4 months, and a cow in front of her that looked like it belonged in a rendering pit, not a pasture. Its ribs showed through a hide the color of old rope. Its hip bones jutted like tent poles. The auctioneer had already moved on to the next lot before anyone noticed her hand still raised. "You're buying that?" The man beside her, a hog farmer named Delackers, didn't bother lowering his voice. "Etta, that cow's not worth the rope holding it to the fence." She didn't answer him. She was watching the cow's eyes. They were clear. Whatever was wrong with that animal, it wasn't in its eyes, and Etta Vance had spent enough years around cattle to know that clear eyes meant something worth investigating. She paid $40 for the cow, a fair price, even a generous one, for an animal the auctioneer had all but written off, and led it home on a rope, 5 months pregnant herself. It was the $160 left in her tin box that worried her more. That was everything remaining after her husband's funeral, and the bank's second notice on the loan, and it would have to carry her and this cow through a Missouri winter, or neither of them would see spring. By the end of that year, people would drive from 3 counties over just to buy what that cow eventually gave them. But in October of 1983, standing in a gravel lot outside Sikeston, Missouri, gambling nearly every dollar she had left in the world on an animal nobody else wanted, nobody, including Etta, knew that yet. If you think ordinary people solving impossible problems is worth remembering, consider subscribing. We tell these stories so the knowledge that once lived only in farmers' hands doesn't disappear. And tell us where you're watching from. To understand why Etta Vance spent her last dollars on a dying cow, you have to go back 6 months, to the spring her husband Wilmer was killed when his tractor rolled on the hill pasture behind the barn. He left her 40 acres of hill ground, a mortgage 2 payments behind at nearly 20% interest, and a baby on the way. Her brother offered to take her in. She said no. She had grown up on a dairy farm her own family lost during a hard stretch in the mid-1970s, and she knew cattle the way some women knew sewing. It was the only asset she had that the bank hadn't already priced. The farm had 1 milk cow left, an old Guernsey gone dry with age, and a corn crib half empty from a poor harvest. Winter was 6 weeks out. She needed a cow that could produce, and she had $200 standing between her family and nothing, money that also had to cover feed, propane, and whatever the baby would need come spring. Every healthy bred cow at the sale that day was going for $800 or more, ordinary money in a year, when interest rates alone were eating farms alive across that end of the state, but so far beyond what she had that it wasn't even worth studying. Then the auctioneer brought out the last lot of the day, a Jersey cross nobody wanted, condemned as a loss before the bidding even opened, the kind of animal that sold for whatever a buyer was willing to risk on it. She isn't lucky. She pays attention. That difference would matter more than anyone in that gravel lot could have guessed. Etta had learned, from her father, that a starving animal and a dying animal don't look the same up close, even if they look identical from the rail. She checked the cow's gums, pink, not gray. She checked its breathing, slow, not labored, no rattle in the chest that would have told her pneumonia. She ran a hand along its spine and felt bone, but no heat, no swelling in the joints that would have signaled infection working through the animal's blood. She lifted a hoof and turned it over. No rot, no smell, no cracking at the wall that would mean the cow had gone weeks without standing on dry ground. She peeled back an eyelid. No yellow tint, no sign of liver failure. She pressed 2 fingers into the hide along the flank and watched how slowly it sprang back. Dehydration, but not the kind that comes from disease, the kind that comes from an animal too weak to walk to water on its own. What she saw, piece by piece, was an animal that had simply not eaten enough for a long time, starved, not sick, and a belly telling her it was carrying a calf due sometime after Christmas. Everyone else in that lot had looked at a wreck. Etta looked at a cow 6 weeks of hay away from being worth 10 times what she'd paid. The first month tested that theory hard. She started the cow on small, frequent feedings, a decision that confused her neighbors, who assumed more feed meant faster recovery. She'd seen a starved animal founder before from being fed too much too fast, its gut unable to handle the load, and she wasn't willing to lose the cow to kindness. She measured out corn and hay by the coffee can, twice what a normal cow needed in frequency, half what it needed in volume per feeding, and she wrote the amounts in a ledger her husband had used for seed orders. Twice that first week, the cow went down in the night, and twice Etta walked out in the cold in her nightgown to get it back on its feet, because a downed cow that can't rise is a cow that dies within days. She kept the ledger honest, the way her husband had kept his seed accounts, not rounding up, not skipping a bad day. Some entries read no gain, 3 days running, and she made herself write those down too, because a farmer who only records the good weeks learns nothing from the bad ones. She built a lean-to windbreak out of scrap lumber, so the cow wouldn't burn what little energy it had shivering through October nights. Another lesson from a father, who used to say that cold cost a farmer more feed than hunger did. By the second week, the ribs had begun to soften under a thin layer of new flesh. By the fourth, the cow was grazing on its own and gaining steadily, and Etta had stopped waking at 2 in the morning to check on it. Del Ackers, passing on the road, admitted the animal didn't look like it was fixing to die no more. The kind of grudging compliment that told Etta she'd been right, though he still doubted the cow would ever pay for itself. That should have been good news. It wasn't the end of the trouble. The pregnancy was the next risk, and the more dangerous one. A cow that had been starved for months going into calving was a cow whose body had few reserves to draw from. Etta increased protein slowly through the fall, dried soybean meal she traded 4 dozen eggs to get from a neighbor, and watched the udder for the swelling that would signal calving was close. When the cow went into labor on a January night with ice on the windows, Etta was 8 months pregnant herself, alone in the barn with a lantern, and the calf had turned wrong in the birth canal, one leg folded back instead of forward. She didn't have the strength to pull it, and knew better than to try. She reached in only far enough to hook 2 fingers around the folded leg and ease it straight, then stepped back and let the cow's own labor do the rest. The calf came at 3 in the morning, alive, into 11-degree air. The calf lived. So did the cow. And within days, Etta noticed something the sale barn men had never mentioned, because none of them had ever let the animal recover enough to show it. The milk this cow gave was thick, almost yellow, with a cream line that rose nearly 2 inches in the pail overnight. Jersey blood ran heavy through her, and Jersey milk carried more butter fat than any other dairy breed in the country, a fact Etta remembered from her father's old herd, back when the family still had one worth remembering. She started skimming that cream and churning butter twice a week, the same way her mother had, using a hand-crank barrel churn she'd kept in the barn loft for no reason she could name at the time. One of those objects saved out of habit, not need, that would matter more than she knew. She worked the cream at cool morning temperatures, the way she remembered, washing the butter afterward in cold well water to press out the buttermilk, because leftover buttermilk in the fat was what turned butter sour fastest. She salted it lightly, wrapped it in cloth, and carried her first batch of 8 pounds into town feeling, for the first time in a year, something close to hope. It came back a week later, rancid, and the storekeeper refused to buy from her again. She'd churned it right, she'd packed it wrong. Butter held too warm, even for a day, turned within a week in a Missouri autumn, and she'd been storing it in a kitchen cupboard because the refrigerator had quit the winter before, and there hadn't been money to fix it or replace it. She studied the problem the way she'd studied the cow, not guessing, but testing. She dug a shallow springhouse pit into the hillside near the creek, packed the butter in stoneware crocks under a layer of brine-soaked cloth, the old method her grandmother had shown her as a girl, back before either of them had ever owned a refrigerator worth trusting, and kept it below 50 degrees even in warm weather. No electricity required, just cold groundwater and patience. The next batch held for 3 weeks without turning. The storekeeper took her back on consignment, unconvinced, and told her plainly that one more bad batch would end the arrangement for good. She pressed the crocks deeper into the springhouse pit, checked the temperature morning and evening with a hand against the stoneware, and began marking each batch with the date it was churned, so that nothing ever sat longer than she knew it could hold. Within 2 months, the storekeeper was asking for double what she brought him, because customers had started asking for the Vance butter by name, saying it tasted richer than anything else on the shelf, which it did, because most farm butter in that county came from mixed-breed cows nowhere near as rich in cream as a Jersey. For the first time since Wilmer died, the numbers began to work. Butter money covered feed. Feed kept the cow and calf strong. The strong cow kept producing the cream that made the butter people wanted. It was a small, tight circle, but it was hers, and it was working. Then someone arrived with a problem she hadn't planned for. In February, Etta gave birth to a healthy baby after a winter pregnancy that had asked almost as much of her as the cows had. She was exhausted, but the farm was finally beginning to hold together. The cow was healthy. The calf was growing, the butter was selling, and for the first time since Wilmer died, Etta had something that looked less like survival and more like a future. Then in March, a man named Otis Pruitt drove up the lane, the cow's original owner, the one who'd sold it at auction as a loss he was glad to be rid of. He'd heard about the calf and about the butter money, and he told Etta the calf was rightfully his, because the bill of sale, he claimed, had only covered the cow itself, not future increase. He brought his brother-in-law with him, a man who worked part-time for the county clerk, as if the presence of someone official might settle the matter before it ever reached a courtroom. It was a claim built on a technicality, and in a county where cattle disputes sometimes ended in real legal trouble for a woman alone with no husband to stand beside her, it was a serious threat to everything she'd built over a hard, careful year. She didn't argue with him in the yard. She went inside, where her newborn was resting, and came back with the seed ledger, the same one she'd used to track feed rations, and inside its back cover, folded flat, was the auction receipt she'd kept without thinking twice at the time, the same habit that had kept the old churn in the loft. It read plainly, "Cow, in calf, sold as is, full ownership transferred." By the long-standing custom every stockman in the county understood, and by the plain wording written on that receipt, a calf carried inside a cow at the moment of sale belonged to whoever owned the cow when it was born, not to the man who'd sold her 9 months before believing the pregnancy would end in a dead calf or a dead cow. Otis Pruitt had signed away that claim himself, in his own hand, on a day he'd been glad to be rid of both. He left without the calf, and without much of his pride. Word of that visit moved through the county faster than the butter had. People who'd laughed at Etta Vance for buying a dying cow started showing up for other reasons, asking how she'd nursed the animal back, asking to buy a heifer calf out of that bloodline, asking, eventually, whether she'd teach a daughter or a neighbor's wife the springhouse method that kept butter from turning. Delackers himself sent his boy over that summer to learn how she judged a starved animal from a dying one, an admission he never quite put into words but showed plainly enough by showing up at all. By the following winter, Etta Vance owned 3 cows in the herd built from that original bloodline, a standing order with 2 stores in town, and a reputation nobody in that county would have predicted the day she raised her hand at the auction. She had not gotten rich. She had gotten steady, which mattered more. What she'd bought for $40 desperate was never really a dying cow. It was a piece of forgotten knowledge, how to tell starvation from disease, how to feed a wrecked body back to health without killing it with kindness, how to keep butter cold without power when there was no money for a new refrigerator, carried forward by a woman who paid attention when everyone else around her had already looked away. That knowledge outlived the cow, the way it was always meant to. It moved into a neighbor's barn, into the hands of the next generation, into a county that had learned, slowly and without much ceremony, that the woman they'd once called foolish had simply seen further than they had. Etta kept that first seed ledger for the rest of her life, the pages gone soft and brown at the corners, the auction receipt still folded flat inside the back cover, where she'd tucked it without a second thought on the day she led a starving cow home on a rope. Never called it luck, she called it paying attention, and she said it plainly enough, and often enough, that the people around her eventually stopped arguing and started listening instead.